Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The winter of 1912 settled over the Cumberland Gap region with an unusual severity that the mountain folk would remember for decades to come. Snow accumulated in drifts that reached the windows of the scattered cabins dotting the hollers and ridges of southeastern Kentucky, where the Virginia and Tennessee borders converged in a landscape of ancient stone and impenetrable forest. It was a winter that seemed to stretch time itself, making days feel shorter and nights impossibly long. For the residents of Kettle Creek Hollow, a remote settlement accessible only by a narrow wagon trail that wound precariously along the mountainside, the isolation was nothing new. But for Ruth Calder, that winter would mark the beginning of something far more sinister than harsh weather. The Calder homestead sat perched on a natural shelf of limestone approximately 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, the Harwick cabin. Built in 1889 by Ruth's husband, Josiah Calder, the 2-story log structure reflected the practical needs of mountain life rather than any aesthetic ambitions. Thick chestnut logs chinked with clay and moss formed walls capable of withstanding the fierce winds that swept down from Pine Mountain. The house featured a stone chimney at each end, a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides, and windows fitted with heavy wooden shutters that could be barred from the inside. Behind the main house stood a smokehouse, a root cellar carved into the hillside, and a small barn that housed their livestock during the harshest months. Ruth herself was known throughout the scattered communities of Pike County as a woman of uncommon intelligence and determination. Born Ruth Carmichael in 1875 in the Pound Gap area, she had received an education unusual for mountain women of her generation, having been taught to read and write by a traveling circuit preacher who had taken particular interest in her quick mind. When she married Josiah Calder in 1894, she brought to the union not only her considerable domestic skills, but also a collection of books and the habit of keeping detailed records of household affairs, weather patterns, and local events in a series of bound notebooks. The official records from Pike County show that Ruth and Josiah lived quietly and productively on their mountain farm. Josiah worked occasionally in the coal mines near Pikeville when cash money was needed, but primarily supported his household through farming, hunting, and the production of moonshine whiskey that he sold to distributors in the county seat. Ruth managed their subsistence farming operations, tended to their animals, and maintained the extensive vegetable gardens that provided much of their food during the long winters. According to tax records, they owned their land free and clear, having inherited it from Josiah's father Mordecai Calder, who had claimed the property under homestead laws in 1867. The first indication that something was amiss came not from the Calder homestead itself, but from Madrigal Harwick, their nearest neighbor, who visited the Pike County Courthouse in Pikeville on February 23, 1912, to file what the county clerk recorded as an inquiry regarding the welfare of neighbors. According to the handwritten document preserved in the county archives, Madrigal reported that she had not seen smoke rising from the Calder chimney for over 2 weeks, despite the continuing severe cold that would have made heating fires essential for survival. Madrigal's statement, as recorded by courthouse clerk Zebedee Mullins, provides the earliest documented evidence of the case. "I ain't one to meddle in folks' business, but it ain't natural for a house to stand cold in weather like this. Ruth Calder is a practical woman who wouldn't let her fires die unless something prevented her from keeping them lit. Me and my husband Virgil walked partway up their trail 3 days back, but the snow was too deep to make it all the way to their place. We called out, but heard nothing back. The silence up there ain't right." The county sheriff at the time, Cornelius Branham, was a man of limited resources and competing priorities. His jurisdiction covered over 700 square miles of rugged mountain terrain, and winter conditions made travel to remote areas extremely difficult. According to his notes, found decades later in a trunk stored in the courthouse basement, Sheriff Branham initially assumed that the Calders had simply decided to wait out the worst of the winter weather without venturing outside more than necessary. Many mountain families adopted such strategies during particularly harsh seasons, burning only what fuel was absolutely required and keeping their activities to a minimum to conserve resources. However, Madrigal Harwick proved persistent in her concerns. She returned to the courthouse on March 2, 1912, this time accompanied by her husband Virgil and another neighbor, Iphigenia Metcalf, who lived approximately 5 miles east of the Calder property. Their collective testimony prompted Sheriff Branham to organize an expedition to investigate the situation firsthand. The group, consisting of the sheriff, his deputy Uriah Combs, and the 3 concerned neighbors, departed Pikeville on horseback on the morning of March 4, 1912. The journey to the Calder homestead required nearly 6 hours due to snow-covered trails and fallen trees that blocked several sections of the mountain path. According to Sheriff Branham's official report, filed upon his return to Pikeville, the party reached the Calder property at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon. What they found there would haunt their memories for years to come. The house stood eerily quiet against the winter landscape, with no smoke rising from either chimney and no signs of recent human activity around the buildings. Snow had accumulated in undisturbed drifts against the doors and windows, suggesting that no one had entered or exited the structure for an extended period. More disturbing was the absence of animal sounds from the barn. During winter months, livestock would typically be heard moving about and vocalizing, especially when approached by humans who might bring feed. Deputy Combs circled the barn while Sheriff Branham approached the main house. Inside the barn, Combs discovered the bodies of the Calders' livestock, 2 cows, several pigs, and a dozen chickens, all apparently dead from starvation and cold. The animals showed no signs of violent death, but their condition suggested they had been left unattended for several weeks. The water troughs were frozen solid, and no hay or feed remained in the storage areas. At the house itself, Sheriff Branham found the front door secured with its wooden bar in place, indicating that it had been locked from the inside. The windows were similarly barred. After calling out for several minutes without receiving any response, the sheriff decided to force entry through a rear window that appeared to have been left unlatched. The interior of the house revealed a scene that he would later describe as orderly but unnatural. The main room showed clear evidence of recent occupation. A partially consumed meal remained on the table, with plates and utensils arranged as if the diners had simply stepped away temporarily. A fire had been laid in the hearth but remained unlit, with kindling and split logs arranged precisely as if someone had prepared to light it but never completed the task. Throughout the house, personal belongings remained in their expected places. Ruth's books on their shelf, clothing folded in trunks, cooking utensils clean and organized in the kitchen area. However, there was no sign of Ruth or Josiah Calder themselves. Their absence was made more mysterious by the presence of their winter coats hanging on pegs near the door, their boots arranged neatly underneath. In the depth of an Appalachian winter, no one would venture outside without proper clothing and footwear, yet these essential items remained in the house. Sheriff Branham's report notes that the couple's bedroom showed evidence of normal use. The bed was unmade as if recently slept in, and Ruth's personal effects were arranged on a small table beside it. The most puzzling discovery came when Deputy Combs investigated the root cellar carved into the hillside behind the house. According to his supplementary report, the cellar had been accessed recently, with footprints visible in the dirt floor despite the cold that should have prevented the ground from showing clear impressions. More intriguing was the state of the food stores. The cellar contained ample supplies to sustain 2 people through the winter, including preserved meats, root vegetables, canned goods, and several barrels of grain. None of these supplies appeared to have been disturbed, suggesting that the Calders had not been relying on their stored food despite their apparent disappearance weeks earlier. In a corner of the root cellar, Deputy Combs found Ruth's leather-bound record books, stacked neatly on a wooden shelf. These notebooks, which Ruth had maintained faithfully for nearly 2 decades, contained detailed entries documenting daily life on the mountain farm. The most recent entries, dating to January 1912, appeared normal in their content and tone, recording weather observations, notes about the animals, and routine household activities. However, the final entry, dated January 18, 1912, consisted of only a single line written in Ruth's characteristic careful handwriting. Josiah has agreed to the terms. No context was provided for this cryptic statement, and no previous entries in any of the notebooks made reference to any kind of agreement or negotiation. The books showed Ruth's methodical personality clearly. She recorded everything from the first frost dates to the quantities of vegetables preserved each fall, from the health of livestock to the visits of traveling peddlers. The sudden shift to such an enigmatic final entry represented a complete departure from her established pattern of detailed, factual documentation. Sheriff Branham and his party conducted a thorough search of the surrounding area but found no trace of the missing couple. The snow around the house showed no footprints or other signs that anyone had left the property recently. The search extended to a radius of several hundred yards from the buildings, including the areas around the barn, outhouse, and various outbuildings. They examined the trail leading down from the property to ensure that no bodies lay along the path that the Calders might have taken if they had attempted to leave on foot. The investigating party spent 2 nights at the Calder homestead, hoping that the missing couple might return or that some evidence of their fate might become apparent. During their stay, several members of the group reported experiencing sensations that they found difficult to explain. According to statements given individually and recorded by Sheriff Branham, both Madrigal Harwick and Iphigenia Metcalf complained of feeling constantly watched while in the house, despite thorough searches confirming that no one else was present. Deputy Combs noted in his personal account, discovered years later among his effects, that the house seemed to retain an unusual stillness even when occupied by the search party. "Sound didn't carry right in that place," he wrote. "You could speak to someone in the next room and they might not hear you, but sometimes you'd catch voices that seemed to come from outside, when you knew everyone was accounted for inside. None of us slept well those 2 nights." More concerning were the noises that the search party reported hearing during the nighttime hours. All members of the group described a rhythmic creaking sound that seemed to come from the walls of the house itself, as if the structure were settling or shifting, but in a regular pattern that suggested deliberate rather than natural movement. The sound would begin shortly after sunset and continue intermittently throughout the night, always following the same rhythm. 3 short creaks, followed by a longer pause, then 2 longer creaks, then silence for several minutes before the pattern repeated. Virgil Harwick, who possessed considerable experience with log construction, having built several cabins in the area, examined the structure carefully but could find no explanation for the sounds. The chinking between the logs showed no signs of failure, the foundation appeared solid, and none of the wooden components showed evidence of stress or movement. Yet the creaking continued each night with mechanical regularity, seeming to emanate from different sections of the walls at different times. On the morning of March 7th, the search party prepared to return to Pikeville with the grim conclusion that Ruth and Josiah Calder had vanished under circumstances that defied rational explanation. Sheriff Branham secured the property by boarding up the broken window through which they had gained entry and noting the condition of all buildings for future reference. The livestock that had perished from neglect were buried in a common grave behind the barn, and the house was left as it had been found, with the understanding that any relatives of the missing couple would need to be contacted to determine the disposition of the property. However, as the party prepared to depart, Iphigenia Metcalf made a discovery that added a new dimension to the mystery. While collecting her belongings from the house, she noticed something that had apparently escaped attention during their previous searches. A trapdoor in the floor of the main room, partially concealed beneath a braided rug. The door was fitted so precisely into the floorboards that it was nearly invisible unless examined from a specific angle when morning light entered through the windows. The trapdoor opened to reveal a narrow space beneath the house, too small to be called a basement, but large enough for a person to stand upright. The area had been excavated from the natural earth and lined with flat stones, creating a chamber approximately 6 feet square and 7 feet deep. A wooden ladder led down into the space, and oil lamps mounted on the walls provided illumination. The purpose of this hidden room was not immediately apparent, but its existence suggested that the Calders had been engaged in some activity that they preferred to keep concealed. Inside the underground chamber, the search party found several items that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. A large wooden table occupied the center of the space, its surface marked with what appeared to be measurements and calculations carved directly into the wood. The walls were lined with shelves containing glass jars filled with various substances. Some appeared to be plant materials, others contained liquids of different colors, and several held what looked like soil samples from different locations. Most intriguing were the papers found stacked on the table. Written in Josiah's handwriting, these documents appeared to be some kind of correspondence, though the identity of the other party was never clearly indicated. The papers were dated between October 1911 and January 1912, suggesting that whatever arrangement they documented had been developing for several months before the couple's disappearance. The content of these documents was cryptic, referring frequently to the agreement, the specified time, and the necessary preparations, but providing no clear explanation of what these terms meant. One letter, dated December 15, 1911, provided slightly more detail. Ruth has been informed of the conditions and has given her consent. We understand that the arrangement, once finalized, cannot be altered or withdrawn. The date of January 20th has been confirmed, and we will ensure that all necessary preparations are completed by that time. The location has been prepared as discussed, and we await your final confirmation of the terms. Another document, apparently Josiah's draft of a response to some communication, stated, "We agree to the terms as outlined, with the understanding that Ruth will be protected according to our previous discussions. The payment arrangement is acceptable, and we confirm our commitment to complete the transaction on the agreed date. The hidden chamber has been prepared as requested, and all materials have been gathered according to your specifications." These papers raised more questions than they answered. Who was the unnamed correspondent? What kind of arrangement had the Calders entered into? What was the significance of January 20th, 1912, and what was supposed to have happened on that date? The references to payment and protection suggested some kind of business transaction, but the secretive nature of the correspondence and the existence of the hidden chamber implied that the matter was not entirely legitimate. Sheriff Branham collected all the documents found in the underground chamber and returned to Pikeville to begin a more formal investigation. His efforts to locate relatives of the missing couple revealed that both Ruth and Josiah had been essentially orphaned, with no surviving family members who might have knowledge of their activities or whereabouts. Inquiries among the residents of Pike County and surrounding areas produced no information about any strangers who might have been conducting business with the Calders during the months preceding their disappearance. The sheriff's investigation did uncover one potentially significant detail through interviews with local residents. Several people reported having seen an unfamiliar man in the area during late 1911 and early 1912, always traveling alone on horseback and typically observed near the mountain trails that led to the more remote homesteads. The descriptions of this individual were remarkably consistent: a tall, thin man wearing dark clothing and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. He never stopped to speak with anyone or sought lodging in town, but seemed to appear periodically and then vanish again. Mordecai Blackthorne, who operated a general store in Pikeville, reported that this mysterious visitor had made several purchases during his appearances in town, always paying with silver coins rather than the paper currency that was more commonly used for such transactions. According to Blackthorne's account, the stranger had purchased items that seemed unusual for a typical traveler: lengths of rope, various chemicals that were normally used for mining operations, glass containers, and substantial quantities of lamp oil. He never engaged in conversation beyond what was necessary to complete his purchases, and he always left town immediately after conducting his business. Most intriguingly, Blackthorne recalled that during the stranger's final visit to his store in mid-January 1912, the man had asked specific questions about the location of the Calder homestead. He had inquired about the best route to reach their property and had asked whether they lived alone or had family members who might visit during the winter months. When Blackthorne asked if he had business with the Calders, the stranger had simply replied that he was completing an arrangement and had left without further explanation. This information led Sheriff Branham to theorize that the Calders might have been victims of some kind of criminal scheme, possibly related to their isolated location and relative prosperity. However, this theory was complicated by the fact that nothing appeared to have been stolen from their property. All valuable items remained in place, including Ruth's jewelry and a substantial amount of cash money that Josiah kept in a strongbox in their bedroom. If robbery had been the motive, the crime had been carried out in a most peculiar manner. The investigation continued through the spring of 1912, but produced no new evidence that might explain the fate of Ruth and Josiah Calder. Sheriff Branham interviewed dozens of residents throughout the mountain region, checked records in neighboring counties for any reports of unidentified individuals or unusual activities, and corresponded with law enforcement agencies in Tennessee and Virginia to determine whether similar disappearances had been reported. All of these efforts proved fruitless. By summer 1912, the case was effectively closed due to lack of evidence or leads. The Calder property was declared abandoned, and since no legal heirs could be located, it eventually reverted to county ownership. The house and outbuildings were left unoccupied, slowly deteriorating under the effects of weather and neglect. Local residents avoided the area, partly due to its reputation for being associated with the mysterious disappearance, but also because of continuing reports of strange phenomena occurring there. These reports began almost immediately after Sheriff Branham's investigation concluded. Travelers using the mountain trails near the Calder property reported seeing lights in the windows of the house during nighttime hours, despite the fact that the building was known to be unoccupied. The lights appeared to move from room to room in a purposeful pattern, as if someone were carrying a lamp through the house while conducting routine activities. However, when curious individuals approached the property to investigate, the lights would disappear and the house would appear dark and empty. More disturbing were the sounds that people reported hearing in the vicinity of the abandoned homestead. The same rhythmic creaking that Sheriff Branham's search party had noted was frequently described by passers-by, along with other noises that seemed to suggest ongoing activity in and around the buildings. People reported hearing the sound of footsteps on the porch, doors opening and closing, and what sounded like normal conversation between two people, though the words were never clear enough to be understood. Cornelius Vance, a traveling preacher who regularly rode the mountain circuits to bring religious services to isolated communities, kept a detailed journal of his experiences throughout the region. His entry for September 14th 1912, describes an encounter near the Calder property that typified many such reports. Passed near the abandoned house where the Calders vanished. Though the sun had set, warm light glowed from the windows as if the family were home for their evening meal. The sight gave me comfort, thinking perhaps the mystery had been resolved and the couple had returned. I approached to offer my services, but as I drew near, the lights dimmed and vanished. When I reached the house, I found it dark and cold as expected, with boards still nailed across the broken window. Yet I could swear I heard voices from inside, not menacing, but conversational, as if two people were discussing the events of their day. I called out but received no response, and the voices faded to silence. These phenomena continued to be reported with such regularity that the Calder homestead acquired a reputation throughout the region as a place to be avoided after dark. The practical effect was to make the property even more isolated than it had been during the Calder's lifetime, as travelers would adjust their routes to avoid passing too close to the buildings during evening or nighttime hours. In 1915, the county decided to auction the abandoned property in an effort to return it to productive use. The sale was announced in regional newspapers and attracted considerable interest due to the quality of the land and buildings. However, the auction was ultimately canceled when no one appeared on the scheduled date to place bids. Later inquiries revealed that while many potential buyers had initially expressed interest, all had withdrawn upon learning the specific location of the property and its association with the unsolved disappearance. A second attempt to auction the property in 1917 met with similar results. This time, several bidders appeared at the courthouse on the appointed day, but all withdrew their offers when reminded of the property's history. One potential buyer, a farmer named Titus Branham, who was interested in expanding his holdings, later explained his decision to withdraw. "I ain't a superstitious man, but I've got a family to think about. There's plenty of good land in these mountains without choosing a place where folks just vanish into thin air. Whatever happened to the Calders, I don't want it happening to my wife and children." The property remained in county ownership for several more years, slowly deteriorating due to neglect. The roof of the house began to leak, allowing weather to damage the interior. Animals took up residence in the barn and outbuildings. Vegetation began to reclaim the cleared areas where the Calders had maintained their gardens and fields. By 1920, the homestead was beginning to resemble a ruin rather than a temporarily abandoned residence. However, the reports of mysterious lights and sounds did not diminish as the buildings decayed. If anything, they seemed to increase in frequency and intensity. Dr. Ezekiel Combs, a physician who practiced in Pikeville and occasionally traveled to remote areas to treat patients, documented several encounters with these phenomena in letters to his brother that were discovered after his death in 1954. In one letter, dated August 1918, he wrote, "I was returning from treating the Mullins family up on Pine Ridge when I was forced to take shelter from a sudden thunderstorm. The abandoned Calder place was the only structure within miles, so I reluctantly approached it for protection from the rain. As I drew near, I was amazed to see that the house appeared to be inhabited once again. Warm light shone from the windows, and I could hear what sounded like a woman singing while she worked. Thinking that someone had finally moved in and restored the property, I called out to announce my presence. The singing stopped immediately, and the lights began to dim one by one, as if someone were extinguishing lamps throughout the house. By the time I reached the porch, the building was dark and silent. When I tried the door, I found it secured from the inside. I spent the night under the porch roof listening to the storm, but I heard no further sounds from within the house. Similar accounts accumulated over the years, creating a substantial body of testimony about ongoing activity at the supposedly abandoned property. What made these reports particularly compelling was their consistency and the credibility of many witnesses. The individuals who reported these experiences included respected members of the community, ministers, teachers, merchants, and local officials who had no apparent reason to fabricate such stories. In 1923, a significant development occurred that brought new attention to the Calder case. During routine maintenance work on the courthouse in Pikeville, workers discovered a sealed compartment behind a false wall in the basement. Inside this compartment were several boxes of documents that had apparently been hidden there deliberately, though no one could recall when or why. Among these papers were additional materials related to the Calder investigation, including documents that Sheriff Branham had apparently set aside for reasons that were never explained. The most significant item in this cache was a letter addressed to Sheriff Branham and postmarked from Knoxville, Tennessee, on March 15, 1912, just 8 days after his search party had returned from the Calder homestead. The letter was signed by someone identifying himself as J. Whitman, attorney at law, though no attorney by that name could be located in Knoxville or elsewhere in Tennessee. The content of the letter was both cryptic and disturbing. Sheriff Branham, I understand from certain sources that you have been investigating the disappearance of Josiah and Ruth Calder from their residence in Pike County. I write to inform you that this matter is not what it appears to be, and that continued investigation may prove dangerous to yourself and others involved. The Calders entered into certain arrangements voluntarily, and their current situation reflects the fulfillment of those arrangements rather than any criminal activity. I strongly advise you to close your investigation immediately and to discourage others from pursuing the matter further. Some agreements extend beyond the normal understanding of law and order, and this is such a case. For your own welfare, I recommend that you accept the situation as it stands and direct your attention to other matters. This letter raised numerous questions about Sheriff Branham's handling of the case and his apparent decision to conceal certain information from the public record. Why had he hidden this correspondence rather than investigating its implications? What did the letter writer mean by certain arrangements and agreements that extend beyond the normal understanding of law and order? Who were the certain sources that had informed this mysterious attorney about the investigation? Unfortunately, Sheriff Branham had died in 1920, taking whatever knowledge he might have possessed to the grave. His successor, Sheriff Nathaniel Metcalf, attempted to reopen the investigation based on the newly discovered documents, but was unable to locate any trace of the supposed attorney who had written the threatening letter. No law firm in Knoxville had any record of a J. Whitman, and postal authorities could provide no information about the origin of the letter, beyond confirming that it had indeed been mailed from that city on the indicated date. Sheriff Metcalf's reinvestigation did produce one new piece of evidence. However, during a thorough search of county records, he discovered that in November 1911, just 2 months before the Calders' disappearance, Josiah had filed a document with the county clerk that had apparently been misfiled and overlooked during the original investigation. The document was titled Declaration of Personal Obligation and contained language that seemed to relate to the mysterious correspondence found in the hidden chamber beneath the Calder house. The declaration stated, "I, Josiah Calder, being of sound mind and acting of my own free will, do hereby acknowledge that I have entered into certain obligations that may require the fulfillment of specific terms at a future date to be determined by parties other than myself. In the event that such fulfillment becomes necessary, I declare that my wife Ruth Calder has been fully informed of the nature of these obligations and has consented to whatever actions may be required. This declaration is made for the purpose of establishing that any future actions taken in connection with these obligations should be considered voluntary rather than coerced." This document was witnessed by 2 signatures, M. Whitman and E. Whitman, raising the possibility that the attorney who had written to Sheriff Branham was connected to witnesses of Josiah's declaration. However, no residents of Pike County could recall anyone by the name of Whitman, and no records could be found of such individuals in the area during 1911 or 1912. The language of Josiah's declaration was clearly intended to provide legal protection for some future action, but the specific nature of the obligations was not explained. The emphasis on voluntary consent suggested that whatever was planned might appear coercive or criminal to outside observers, but that the parties involved wished to establish their willing participation in advance. Combined with the correspondence found in the underground chamber, this declaration painted a picture of the Calders as active participants in some kind of prearranged event, rather than victims of a crime. Yet this interpretation raised even more disturbing questions about what kind of arrangement would require such elaborate legal precautions and such secretive preparation. Sheriff Metcalf's reinvestigation was cut short in 1924 when he suffered a serious accident while inspecting the Calder property. According to his official report, he had been examining the underground chamber when the wooden ladder collapsed, causing him to fall and sustain injuries that required several months of recovery. However, his personal account of the incident, contained in a letter to his wife, suggested that the accident had been more mysterious than his official report indicated. The strangest thing, he wrote, was that the ladder showed no signs of rot or weakness when I examined it afterward. The wood was solid and the construction sound, yet it failed completely when I was halfway down into the chamber. Even more peculiar was what happened while I was trapped down there waiting for help to arrive. I could hear voices coming from somewhere above, not from the house, but from somewhere else, as if people were having a conversation just outside my hearing. The voices seemed to move around the chamber, sometimes close and sometimes distant, but I could never make out what they were saying. When help finally arrived and pulled me out, I asked if anyone else had been on the property, but my deputies said they had seen no one. Following his accident, Sheriff Metcalf became notably reluctant to discuss the Calder case and discouraged others from investigating it further. When asked about his change in attitude, he would only say that some questions were better left unanswered. The case was quietly closed for the second time, and the property was sealed with orders that no one should enter the buildings without official permission. These restrictions remained in place for several years, effectively preserving the Calder homestead in the condition it had been in since the couple's disappearance. However, the prohibition on entering the property did not prevent the continuing reports of mysterious activity there. If anything, the official designation of the site as off-limits seemed to increase public fascination with it and lead to more frequent sightings of unexplained phenomena. During the 1920s and early 1930s, the Calder case became something of a regional legend, passed down through oral tradition and embellished with each retelling. Children were warned not to venture near the abandoned homestead, and adults would cross themselves when passing the area. The story took on supernatural overtones that had not been present in the original accounts, with some versions claiming that the couple's spirits were trapped on the property by the terms of whatever agreement they had made. However, these folk interpretations were challenged in 1934 when Dr. Aldrich Moresby, a professor of anthropology from the University of Kentucky, became interested in the case as part of his research into Appalachian folklore and local legends. Dr. Moresby approached the story from an academic perspective, seeking to separate fact from fiction and to understand the sociological factors that had led to the development of supernatural explanations for the disappearance. Dr. Moresby's investigation was thorough and systematic. He interviewed dozens of people who claimed to have witnessed mysterious phenomena at the Calder property, carefully documenting their accounts and looking for patterns that might suggest natural explanations. He examined all available official records and corresponded with scholars who had studied similar cases of unexplained disappearances in isolated rural areas. His preliminary findings, published in the Journal of American Folklore in 1935, offered a rational analysis of the case that challenged many of the supernatural interpretations that had developed over the years. Dr. Moresby argued that the mysterious lights seen in the abandoned house could be explained by natural phenomena, such as swamp gas, or reflections from more distant light sources. The sounds reported by witnesses could be attributed to structural settling, animal activity, or acoustic effects created by the mountain terrain. More significantly, Dr. Moresby proposed a theory about the disappearance itself that focused on the evidence of the Calders' involvement in illegal activities. He suggested that Josiah and Ruth had been engaged in some kind of criminal enterprise, possibly counterfeiting, given the references to chemicals and the mysterious correspondent's preference for silver coins, and that their disappearance was the result of a business relationship gone wrong rather than supernatural intervention. According to Dr. Moresby's theory, the couple had been working with criminal associates who eventually decided to eliminate them to protect their operation from discovery. The elaborate legal documents and cryptic correspondence were attempts by the criminals to create the appearance of voluntary participation, either to confuse law enforcement or to satisfy some twisted sense of professional ethics. The hidden chamber beneath the house had been used for illicit manufacturing, and the couple's disappearance had occurred when they became a liability to their partners. This rational explanation gained considerable credibility among educated observers and seemed to provide a complete account of the known facts without resorting to supernatural elements. Dr. Moresby's reputation as a serious scholar lent weight to his conclusions, and his theory was widely accepted as the definitive solution to the mystery. However, Dr. Moresby's investigation took an unexpected turn when he decided to spend several nights at the Calder property in order to personally observe any phenomena that might occur there. He obtained permission from county authorities to enter the abandoned buildings and established a temporary research station in the main house. Equipped with various instruments designed to measure temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic fields, and other environmental factors that might explain the reported mysterious activities. Dr. Moresby's detailed journal of his stay at the property, discovered among his papers after his death in 1962, reveals that his experience there fundamentally changed his understanding of the case. His initial entries maintain the objective, scientific tone of his published work, but as the nights progress, his writing becomes increasingly agitated, and his rational explanations begin to break down. His first night at the property passed without incident, leading him to note with satisfaction that the combination of careful observation and scientific instrumentation is proving effective in demystifying what local superstition has transformed into supernatural terror. However, his second night produced experiences that he found more difficult to explain within his theoretical framework. At approximately 11:30 p.m., my instruments began registering temperature fluctuations that followed no pattern I have previously observed. The changes were not gradual, as would be expected from natural causes, but occurred in sharp, regular intervals that seemed to correspond to the rhythm of the creaking sounds described by previous witnesses. More puzzling was the apparent movement of these temperature variations through the house, as if a source of heat were deliberately moving from room to room in a purposeful pattern. Dr. Moresby's account of his third and final night at the property demonstrates a complete abandonment of his original scientific approach. I can no longer maintain the pretense of objective investigation. Whatever occurs in this place operates according to principles that my training and experience have not prepared me to understand. The sounds, the lights, the sensation of being observed. These are not products of imagination or environmental factors. Something deliberate and intelligent is present here, something that responds to human presence but exists according to rules that I cannot comprehend. I am ending my investigation immediately and recommend that this property be left undisturbed permanently. Following his departure from the Calder homestead, Dr. Moresby never published his promised follow-up article about the case. When colleagues inquired about his research, he would only say that his conclusions had been premature and incomplete. He abandoned his study of Appalachian folklore entirely and spent his remaining academic career focused on more conventional anthropological subjects. The journal entries from Dr. Moresby's stay at the property were never intended for publication and were discovered only after his death. His relatives, respecting his apparent wish to keep the details of his experience private, donated his papers to the university archives with the stipulation that they remain sealed for 50 years. The journal was finally made available to researchers in 1985, more than 20 years after the professor's death. The revelation of Dr. Moresby's changed perspective on the case reignited interest in the Calder disappearance among a new generation of investigators. However, by this time, the physical evidence had largely deteriorated beyond usefulness. The homestead buildings had finally collapsed during a severe windstorm in 1958, leaving only foundation stones and scattered debris to mark the location. The underground chamber had been filled with earth and stones, either by natural processes or by human intervention. More significantly, most of the original witnesses to the events surrounding the disappearance had died of old age, taking their first-hand knowledge with them. The case had passed from living memory into historical documentation, making further investigation dependent on written records rather than personal testimony. In 1967, local historian Patience Mullins attempted to compile a comprehensive account of the Calder case for the Pike County Historical Society. Her research uncovered several documents that had been previously overlooked, including correspondence between Sheriff Branham and officials in other counties who had reported similar disappearances during the same time period. These letters suggested that the Calder case was not unique but part of a pattern of unexplained vanishings that occurred throughout the Appalachian region between 1910 and 1915. According to these documents, at least 6 other families had disappeared under circumstances similar to those surrounding the Calders. In each case, the missing persons had been found to have made unusual legal arrangements prior to their disappearance, and mysterious strangers had been reported in the area beforehand. Physical evidence of criminal activity was minimal or absent, and investigations had been hampered by lack of witnesses and the remote locations involved. Most intriguingly, several of the disappearances had occurred on or near January 20th, the date mentioned in the correspondence found beneath the Calder house. This pattern suggested that the date held special significance for whoever had been orchestrating these events, though its meaning remained unclear. Patience Mullins's research also revealed that the mysterious attorney J. Whitman had sent similar threatening letters to law enforcement officials investigating other disappearances in the region. The letters were virtually identical in their language and implications, suggesting that they came from the same source and were part of a coordinated effort to discourage official investigation. However, Mullins's investigation was cut short when she suffered what her family described as a nervous breakdown while reviewing documents related to the case. According to her sister's account, Mullins had been working late one evening when she suddenly began screaming that they were coming for her and that she had learned too much. She was hospitalized for several weeks and, upon her release, refused to discuss the Calder case or any aspect of her research. The documents she had collected were donated to the Pike County Historical Society, but were never organized or made available to the public. The case of Ruth and Josiah Calder remains officially unsolved, though it has been effectively closed due to the passage of time and the lack of living witnesses. The site of their former homestead is now part of a larger tract of land owned by a mining company, and all traces of the original buildings have been removed by industrial activity. Yet the story continues to resonate through the communities of eastern Kentucky, passed down as a cautionary tale about the dangers of making agreements that one does not fully understand. Older residents still speak of seeing lights moving through the forested areas where the Calder property once stood, and hikers occasionally report encounters with a tall, thin figure wearing dark clothing who observes them from a distance before disappearing into the trees. Perhaps most disturbing are the accounts of people who have claimed to hear voices calling their names while traveling through the area, voices that seem to come from beneath the ground itself. These reports are dismissed by most as products of imagination or echo effects created by the mountainous terrain, but they occur with sufficient frequency to maintain the region's reputation as a place where the past refuses to remain buried. The truth about what happened to Ruth and Josiah Calder may never be known with certainty. The evidence suggests that they entered willingly into some kind of arrangement that ultimately led to their disappearance, but the nature of that arrangement and the identity of the other parties involved remain matters of speculation. Whether they were victims of an elaborate criminal scheme, participants in activities that they themselves did not fully understand, or something else entirely, their fate serves as a reminder that even in the modern world, some mysteries resist all attempts at rational explanation. And if you find yourself traveling through the mountains of eastern Kentucky on a winter evening, and you hear voices calling from the darkness beyond your campfire, perhaps it would be wise to remember the story of Ruth Calder. Some agreements, once made, may prove impossible to escape. Some obligations, once accepted, may extend far beyond what was originally understood, and some prices, once agreed upon, may continue to be collected long after the original transaction was believed to be complete. The mountains remember everything, and they forget nothing. In their shadowed hollers and hidden valleys, the past remains present, waiting patiently for those who would seek to understand secrets that were meant to stay buried. The case of Ruth Calder stands as testimony to the enduring power of human curiosity and the equally enduring danger of seeking answers to questions that should never have been asked.